In the spring of 1994, a farmer left his land for the last time. His farm sat high in a valley in the mountains of southern Europe. For 6 generations, his family had raised sheep on these steep slopes. The soil here was thin, and the winters were long and hard. Every field had been cut from the mountainside by hand over centuries. Stone walls held the terraces in place against the wash of the rain. His grandfather had built some of those walls stone by stone. The work had never been easy, and it had never made anyone rich. Winter mornings he broke the ice on the troughs before dawn. He carried hay up to the high fields through deep snow by hand. Lambing season kept him awake for weeks every spring. The mountain gave back a little less for that labor each year. By the 1990s, the farm no longer earned enough to live on. Wool and meat now came from abroad at prices he could not match. A whole year of hard work could be undersold in a single season. One by one, the other farms in the valley had already closed. The young people had left for steady wages in the towns. His own children had gone years before and would not return. He was the last person still working the high ground alone. He was not a young man, and his knees had begun to fail. The bank had grown tired of the farm's thin returns. He knew that once he left, no buyer would want the slope. That winter he decided he could not face another season up there. In April he drove his last flock down the track to the market. He watched the sheep sold off in 2s and 3s to other men. The pens that had been full for generations stood empty by evening. The dogs that had worked the sheep were given to a cousin. He left the plow and the tools to rust in the open shed. The kitchen fire went cold for the first time in memory. Then he climbed back to the farm to close it down for good. He shut the wooden shutters over the windows of the house. He locked the door his family had used for 200 years. The top gate, worn smooth by hands and weather, he left open. There was no one left to close it behind him. He walked down the mountain and did not come back. No new farmer arrived to take the land in hand. The fields he left were smooth and short, cropped by years of grazing. The walls still ran in clean lines across the green slope. A stream had been straightened long ago to drain the wet valley floor. The hay meadow beside it was mown flat every summer without fail. There were no thickets and few places for a wild thing to hide. Long before his family, the whole valley had been forest. Ancient woods once covered these slopes from floor to ridge. Farmers had cleared them, tree by tree, over many centuries. They burned the stumps and grazed sheep on the open ground. The wolves and the deer had been driven out with the trees. Bears had gone from the region long before anyone now alive. The valley he farmed was the tamed remains of a wild place. This was a piece of country shaped entirely by human work. For as long as anyone knew, people had kept it open and bare. When the farmer left, that work simply stopped. No blade cut the grass, no hoof cropped it, no hand cut it back. The mountain was left to itself for the first time in centuries, and the grass, for once, was allowed to grow. By the end of that first summer, the pasture already stood knee-high. Grass that had been kept short for centuries shot up toward the sun. Seeds buried in the soil for decades woke and began to sprout. Wildflowers opened across the old fields in colors no one had sown. Clover, vetch, and knapweed spread through the long grass. Insects arrived within weeks to feed on the sudden bloom. Bees worked the flowers from morning until the light failed. Beetles, butterflies, and hoverflies moved in across the slope. Grasshoppers filled the warm afternoons with sound. Butterflies that need wildflowers came back to breed. Their caterpillars fed on the plants no mower now cut down. Spiders strung their webs between the tall stems. Beetles broke down the dung and dead grass into fresh soil. In the thick cover, voles and mice bred faster than before. The tall grass hid them from the sky and kept them fed. With so many small animals came the hunters that live on them. A fox began to work the field edges at dusk each evening. Kestrels hung over the slope, watching for the smallest movement below. A pair of owls took the empty barn and hunted the meadow. Within a single year, the bare farm was already full of life. That first winter, snow lay deep and unbroken across the fields. No sledge cut a track to the barn, and no smoke rose. Hares crossed the white slope where the sheep had once stood. The farm waited out the cold with no one left to tend it. The old track up to the farm was one of the first to go. Grass and then saplings closed over the worn cart ruts. Nettles and thistles crowded the yard around the house. Ivy climbed the walls of the barn and gripped the stone. Moss spread across the roof tiles that still held. Inside the house, damp crept up the plaster walls. The next spring, the first shrubs pushed up through the grass. Brambles spread out from the shelter of the fallen walls. Thorn and briar crept across the corners of the fields. Their tangled stems gave cover to nesting birds and hiding animals. The first thrushes and warblers moved into the new thickets. They sang from the bramble where there had been only bare grass. A cuckoo returned to the valley after many silent years. Finches and buntings nested low in the spreading scrub. A sparrowhawk began to hunt the small birds through the bushes. Wood mice and shrews spread out under the growing cover. Weasels and stoats followed the mice into the thickets. The seeds had ridden in on wind, on fur, and in droppings. Some had lain in the ground since before the farmer was born. Redstarts and whitethroats sang from the young trees. Glowworms lit the long grass on still summer nights. Anthills rose in the old pasture where the ground lay undisturbed. Blackthorn and hawthorn came next, taller and woodier than the brambles. Then the first true trees arrived on the wind. Birch and willow seeds drifted in and settled on open ground. Pine seedlings crept down from the older forest on the ridge above. Each found bare soil, open sky, and room to grow. Every summer the field held a few more young trees than the last. The first autumn, the young birches turned gold across the slope. Their leaves fell and gathered in drifts among the grass. Insects and worms worked the dead leaves down through the winter. Bats hunted moths above the meadow on warm summer nights. Slow worms and lizards basked on the fallen, sun-warmed stones. Frost and rain worked into the joints of the old walls. With no one to mend them, the walls slumped and fell. Grass and moss closed over the scattered stones within a few years. The wooden fences rotted at the base and sagged to the ground. Fungi spread through the rotting posts and fallen branches. Beetles and their grubs bored into the softening dead wood. Woodlice and centipedes worked the damp ground beneath the logs. The barn lost its first tiles to the wind and began to open. Rain reached the beams, and slowly the building started to sink. Down at the valley floor, the straightened stream began to shift. Silt and fallen branches gathered and slowed the flow. The water spilled sideways out of its dug channel. The drained ground it once kept dry turned soft and wet again. Rushes and sedges grew where the farmer had cut his hay. Shallow pools formed in the low spots and held through the year. Frogs and newts found the new water and moved in to breed. Dragonflies hunted above the pools on warm afternoons. A heron began to visit the wet meadow to fish the shallows. Snipe probed the soft mud with their long bills at dawn. The damp ground drew in animals the dry pasture never could. The soil itself grew richer as leaves and roots built it up. 10 years on, the neat little farm was hard to see at all. Young woodland stood on ground that had been open field. The mountain had begun the long work of covering its scars. Roe deer were among the first large animals to find the new cover. They slipped in from the surrounding hills to feed and to hide. The young trees screened them from view all through the day. The old fields gave richer feeding than the deep forest ever had. With no farmer and no hunters, the deer had little to fear. Their numbers rose year after year across the valley. Red deer came behind them, larger and hungrier than the roe. They grazed the open clearings at first light and again at dusk. Wild boar arrived to root through the soft ground for food. They turned the earth with their snouts after roots and grubs. Their digging buried fresh seeds and opened space for new plants. The boar bred fast in the thick cover and easy feeding. Within a decade, the valley held more large animals than anyone recalled. The growing forest fed all of them and hid all of them. The pioneer birches began to shade out the grass beneath them. Oak and beech seedlings took hold in the shelter they cast. These slower trees would in time become the tallest in the wood. Fallen leaves built a deep, soft layer across the forest floor. Fungi threaded through the ground and fed the roots of the trees. Deer and boar wore trails winding through the undergrowth. Squirrels moved through the young canopy and buried nuts as they went. Jays carried acorns far and forgot where they had hidden them. Those lost acorns grew into the next stand of oaks. Owls nested in the hollows of the older standing trees. Wild cats slipped through the thickets after mice and small birds. Dormice nested in the tangled shrubs between the trees. Beetles and moths filled the night air in their thousands. Nightjars chirred from the clearings after the sun went down. Mushrooms of every kind pushed up through the autumn leaves. Wild fruit trees sprang up from seeds dropped by birds and deer. Apple and cherry grew along the old field edges. Their blossom drew bees back to the slope each spring. Higher up the range, a few beavers had held on along a river. As the young woodland spread, they pushed down into the reclaimed stream. They cut willow and birch along the banks with their teeth. With the felled wood, they built dams across the water. The dams backed the stream up and spread it over the flat ground. A string of ponds formed where the hay meadow had once been. The still water drew in ducks, fish, and clouds of insects. Dead trees stood drowned in the ponds and rotted in place. Woodpeckers cut nest holes in the soft dead wood. Other birds moved into the holes when the woodpeckers left them. Along the ponds, otters began to hunt the fish at dusk. Kingfishers flashed low over the still water after minnows. Pine martens climbed the branches after squirrels and eggs. Badgers dug their sets into the old field banks. The beavers had turned a drainage ditch into a living wetland. The wetland held water back through the dry months of summer. It slowed the floods that once tore down the valley in storms. Toads and newts bred in the still ponds in their thousands. Swallows swept low over the water to feed on rising midges. The beaver ponds caught the silt and cleaned the water flowing on. Downstream, the river ran clearer than it had in decades. The old terraces vanished beneath brambles and young oaks. Each new layer of life made room for another above it. The valley was building a broad base of plants and prey. The same story was playing out far beyond this one farm. Across the region, thousands of upland farms had been left behind. Across Spain and Italy, whole mountain districts emptied of people. In the east, land left after the old collective farms grew wild. Some countries lost more than a tenth of their farmland this way. The reason everywhere was the same as it had been here. The land was too hard, the pay too low, the young gone. Old fields turned to scrub and then to forest across whole districts. Valley after valley followed the path this farmer had set going. Patches of new woodland grew until they touched and merged. They joined into long bands of forest running across the mountains. Animals could travel for miles now without crossing open land. The scattered old forests were joined again by the new growth. A deer could walk from one range to the next under the trees. A young wolf could do the same, if a wolf ever came. Wild Europe was stitching itself back together across the map. No government, no charity, and no plan had drawn it up. The forests were rising on their own, farm by empty farm. The prey now filling them could feed a large and hungry hunter. For the first time in a century, the land was ready for one. Wolves had once ranged across almost every part of Europe. Farmers and governments had spent centuries trying to wipe them out. The animals were shot on sight, poisoned, and hunted with dogs. Bounties were paid for every wolf killed in many countries. By the early 20th century, they were gone from most of the West. A few small groups clung on in the wildest corners of the land. Some survived in the mountains of Italy against long odds. Others held on in the forests of the East and the Balkans. A remnant lingered in the hills of Spain and Portugal. For decades, these last wolves lived hidden and hunted. Then, in the second half of the century, opinion began to turn. People in the cities no longer saw the wolf as an enemy. Laws were passed across Europe to protect the animal at last. By the 1990s, it was illegal to kill a wolf in most countries, safe from the gun, and with prey returning, the wolves spread. They are built to travel far in search of new ground. A young wolf will leave its family to find a range of its own. It may cover hundreds of miles before it settles or finds a mate. Some young wolves crossed motorways, rivers, and whole mountain ranges. One was tracked more than 1,000 miles from where it was born. They walked mostly at night and rested in cover by day. These traveling wolves followed the new corridors of forest. The reforesting farmland gave them cover and food along the way. They moved through country their kind had not seen in generations. One of them, a young male, came at last to the old valley. He arrived in the depth of winter, thin and traveling alone. He had trailed a herd of deer down from the higher hills. For weeks, the only sign of him was tracks in the snow. His prints ran along the ridges and down through the trees. He left his scent on rocks and stumps to mark the ground. One clear night his howl carried down the length of the valley. It was the first wolf howl heard there in 100 years. The deer grew uneasy and raised their heads more often as they fed. Then a second line of tracks appeared beside his in the snow. A female had followed the same forest corridors south. The two wolves found each other in the reclaimed valley. They stayed together through the cold months and hunted as a pair. By spring they had claimed the old farm as their own range. For a den they chose the thickest cover on the slope. The site lay on ground that had once been the top pasture. The gate the farmer left open still leaned nearby, half sunk in earth. In late spring the female bore a litter of 5 pups. They were born on land that had grown a forest around them. For the first weeks the pups stayed hidden underground. The mother rarely left them, while the male brought food. By summer, the pups played at the mouth of the den. The whole pack helped to feed and guard the young. Their howls grew stronger as the pups learned to join in. Wolves hunt as a family, working together to bring down their prey. They test a herd and single out the weak or the slow. Most of their hunts fail, and they go hungry for days. A large kill has to carry the pack through the lean spells. A single red deer could feed the whole family for a week. On a still autumn night, the pack cut a stag from the herd. They ran it along the valley floor until its strength gave out. By morning, little was left but bone and trodden ground. Whatever the wolves left behind, other animals were quick to claim. Foxes came to the carcasses once the pack had moved off. Ravens dropped in to feed and called others down to join them. Badgers and pine martens took their share after dark. Beetles and burying flies worked the bones down to nothing. The carcasses even fed eagles that circled high over the valley. Buzzards and kites came down to the kills right through the winter. The remains of each kill fed the soil beneath them. Flies, worms, and fungi broke the last of it down. Rich green grass grew on those patches by the next spring. A single kill fed a long line of animals down the chain. The wolves were feeding far more than themselves with every hunt. Through the summer the pups grew and first left the den. They followed the adults out to learn the shape of the range. The pack came to know every trail, lookout, and resting place. In winter they followed the deer down to the sheltered valley floor. In summer they ranged high onto the open ridges after prey. The howl of the pack marked the borders of their ground. It warned off strange wolves and kept the family in touch. The pack's range spread across many miles of the reclaimed hills. A lone stranger that crossed into it was driven off or killed. In hard winters, the pack scraped by on whatever it could find. In the good years, the valley fed them well through every season. The wolves sometimes hunted along the edges of the beaver ponds. Deer came to drink there, and the pack learned to wait. Year by year, the pack held its ground and raised new litters. The wolf had come back to stay in a place it had lost. As the years passed, other packs settled the neighboring valleys. Each pack held its own range and left the others alone. The hunting slowly changed how the deer used the land below. The deer could no longer feed in any clearing without risk. They kept on the move, ate quickly, and shunned the open. Places they had once grazed to bare dirt were left for a season. In those gaps, young trees at last grew beyond the reach of teeth. Willow and rowan rose along the stream where deer had kept them low. The new growth shaded the water and cooled it through the summer. Cleaner, cooler water was better for the fish and the insects. Fewer deer crowding the banks let the trampled ground heal over. Thicker cover on the banks gave small birds more places to nest. The wolves also kept the wild boar always on the move. Fewer foxes dared to hunt where the wolves patrolled. Ground-nesting birds raised more young where foxes grew scarce. Hares and grouse grew more common on the open ridges above. A change that began with one hunter reached all the way downstream. None of it had been planned or managed by any person. It all followed from a farmer leaving and a wolf arriving. One winter, a shepherd 2 valleys over lost a lamb to the wolves. Word spread that the old predators were back for good. The next winter, the young wolves helped the adults on the hunt. The year after, some left to find ranges of their own. They walked out along the same corridors that had brought their father. Each carried the pack's line deeper into the recovering land. The wolves were filling the empty country as fast as it grew back. 30 years after the last sheep left, the farm had vanished from view. Trees stood where the fields had been, tall enough to close the sky. The stone house was a low green mound beneath moss and fallen leaves. Wolves denned each spring within sight of its collapsed roof. The valley looked much as it must have before the first farmers came. By now, the same recovery had spread right across the continent. Wolves live today in nearly every country on the European mainland. Their total has climbed into many thousands across the region. They passed through forests that were sheep pasture within living memory. Italy's wolves had never fully gone, and now they were climbing north. From there they crossed into France and on toward the Alps. Packs later reached Belgium, the Netherlands, and Denmark in turn. A wolf was even seen within reach of some of Europe's largest cities. Poland and the Balkans had kept their wolves all along. From those strongholds the animals pushed west and north. Country by country, the empty spaces on the map filled in. France had no wolves at all for most of the 20th century. Germany had none for over 100 years before packs returned. Now both countries hold wolves again, born on old farmland. The animal that people once drove out was walking home across the map. No one had guided it, and no one could easily stop it now. Across the continent, the wild woods were spreading each year. The forests of Europe were larger now than in centuries. Much of that new woodland had been farmland within a lifetime. The land had taken itself back the moment people let it go. No one had to plant the forests or carry the wolves home. The animals in the trees had done the work themselves. All it had cost was time and a little room to grow. The farmer himself did not live to see the wolves return. He died in the town, far from the mountain he had left. He never knew what his empty fields would become. Some of his old neighbors still lived down in the town. A few could remember sheep grazing where the wolves now den. The town below had shrunk as the forest above had grown. Its old school and its one shop had long since closed. The farmer's grandson once walked up to see the old land. He found a forest where his family had once kept sheep. The land asked no one's leave and waited for no one, yet the return has not been welcomed by everyone here. Farmers who still keep livestock now share the land with a predator. Wolves do sometimes kill sheep and calves out on open ground. For a farmer who loses stock, the wolf's return is a real blow. Guard dogs and electric fences can bring the losses down. The old mountain breeds of guardian dog came back into use. These big dogs lived with the flocks and faced the wolves down. Others moved their sheep into pens and sheds at night. Still, a single bad night could undo a year of care. They cannot stop every attack, and the strain on farmers is real. Many governments now pay farmers for animals killed by wolves. Even so, the worry and the anger have not gone away. Some people want the wolves fully protected for good. Others want their numbers held down and their spread checked. The animals slipped away almost unnoticed a century ago. They are coming back into a crowded land that argues over them. Their return is a gain for wild country and a burden for farmers. Both of those things are true at the same time. The wolf had become a test of how much wild people would allow. Living beside a predator asks more of a country than admiring one. The debate over how to live beside them is far from settled. The valley itself takes no side in any of it. Inside it, a wolf pack raises its pups on an old sheep farm. Deer feed in the clearings and melt into the trees at any sound. Beavers work the stream in the last light of the day. Birds fill the young forest with sound from spring to autumn. Hikers now cross the valley on a path worn through the trees. Few of them know a farm once stood on this ground. Fewer still know a wolf pack dens close to the trail. Some nights, walkers hear the howls roll down from the ridge. The sound stops them where they stand in the dark. In the morning, the tracks are there in the mud by the trail. 5 sets of prints, large and small, cross and part again. A whole family passed in the night, and the walkers slept on. In time, people came to the hills hoping to hear the wolves. Guides led them out at dusk to listen from the ridges. A few researchers followed the pack with cameras and collars. The gate the farmer left open still leans there in the grass. Behind it now stands a wood that no hand ever planted. It grew because one tired man closed his door and walked away. 30 years was all the land needed to change beyond knowing. Given room and given time, the wild came back on its own. It is out there still, spreading through the hills, farm by quiet farm. Somewhere tonight, another gate stands open, and the grass is already growing.